A crown lies on the table, its gold dull under the faint light of a dying candle. Once it symbolized divinity and order. Now it seems heavier than the man meant to wear it. Power does not only corrupt, it isolates. It bends the mind until fear begins to sound like divine command and cruelty begins to look like destiny. In the palaces of Rome and London, in the shadowed halls of Istanbul and Beijing, there was always a silence that came before the madness. Servants walked on marble floors afraid to breathe too loudly. Courtiers smiled too long and bowed too low, learning that even a sigh could be taken as treason. Absolute power creates a world where truth disappears and only the will of one man remains. And when no one dares to speak, that man begins to lose his mind in the echo of his own voice. The fall never happens in a single moment. It begins quietly, like dust gathering on gold, a sleepless night, a strange compulsion, a command that makes no sense but no one dares to question. Then the court adapts to his lunacy, and the madness grows roots deep into the kingdom. What begins as a quirk becomes a ritual. What begins as a whim becomes law. By the time anyone sees the truth, the throne has already consumed the man who once ruled from it. These are the stories of kings who mistook their disease for destiny and their fears for faith. Men who ruled the world but could not rule themselves. The insanity you are about to witness is not legend. It is history written in blood, glass, and gold. In every kingdom there comes a moment when the throne stops serving man and begins devouring him. If you wish to uncover the hidden sickness behind history's greatest empires, stay with us and subscribe to our channel, where power reveals its truest face. The air inside the Roman temple was thick with the smell of incense and fear. Priests stood motionless as the young emperor Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus entered. The man the world would come to know as Caligula. He was the third ruler of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the same bloodline as Augustus and Tiberius. And at only 24 years old, he held the might of the Roman Empire in his hands. Rome stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Gaul. Yet all of it now belonged to a single man who no longer saw himself as human. Caligula had once been the darling of the empire. He was born in military camps, raised among soldiers who called him Little Boots, and the people believed he would restore Rome after the gloom of Tiberius. But within months of his coronation in 37 AD, something inside him began to twist. Power isolated him until the line between emperor and god blurred. He declared himself Jupiter reborn, the king of heaven walking the earth, and ordered that every statue of the gods in Rome bear his own face. At festivals, he appeared dressed in gold armor, demanding sacrifices to himself. Senators trembled as he lifted his hand in mock blessing. The empire that once worshipped its gods now bowed to its ruler's madness. Inside the palace, Caligula's feasts became acts of theater. Wine flowed across the tables like blood, while he joked about the value of human life. He executed guests for amusement and then toasted to their memory. Laughter and silence became one sound in that cursed hall. He built marble stables for his horse Incitatus, fed it from an ivory manger, and spoke to it as if it were divine. He planned to appoint the animal a senator so that the Roman elite would understand that their rank meant nothing beside his will. Behind these spectacles hid a lonely terror. Caligula's mind had fractured under the weight of absolute authority. Historians would later name his illness theomania, the delusion of godhood. But his subjects only saw a man possessed by himself. By 41 AD, the same guards who once swore loyalty to him crept through the corridors with drawn blades. When they struck, there was no cry from heaven, only the sound of a mortal body collapsing on marble. Rome washed away the blood, but not the memory. In his fall, the empire learned that when a man believes he is a god, his kingdom will soon become a tomb. Rome learned that gods made of flesh are the most dangerous of all. In the dim light of Whitehall Palace, the king stared into a mirror framed in gold, beneath the heavy jewels and velvet. King Henry VIII saw not majesty, but the slow ruin of his own flesh. His eyes, once bright with youth and certainty, reflected a wound that would never heal. The crown upon his head no longer shone like a symbol of victory. It pulsed like an open sore, feeding on the man who wore it. He had once been the Golden Prince of England, strong, handsome, and adored by his people. Henry had dreamed of a dynasty that would outlive the stones of his castles. Yet power has a way of reshaping men. When no one could deny him, his desires became commands and his fears became law. He broke from the Church of Rome to make himself its god. He took 6 wives to chase a son who would carry his name. And when love turned to suspicion, he turned the wedding bed into a scaffold. The years weighed on him like chains. His body swelled. His skin split beneath the pressure of its own excess. A wound on his leg, born from a jousting accident, festered until it filled his chambers with the stench of rot. Courtiers hid their nausea behind perfumed handkerchiefs, pretending not to see the blood seeping through the king's silk stockings. Physicians, too terrified to tell the truth, whispered prayers instead of remedies, beneath the silk and the steel. Henry was decaying while still alive. Each night, the palace grew quiet except for the drag of his breath and the distant clatter of chains from the tower. He could not sleep. The ghosts of the women he had condemned seemed to whisper in the dark. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard. Their names pressed against his mind like knives. Yet even as his body failed him, the hunger for control did not. He devoured banquets meant for armies and signed death warrants between bites. The food filled his belly, but not the emptiness inside him. The crown consumed what remained of his soul. In his final years, he ruled from a chair reinforced with iron, unable to stand beneath his own weight. Servants lifted him from room to room, their faces pale with dread. He still commanded executions, still demanded obedience. But the empire of his body had already fallen. The man who once defied the Pope now trembled at the smell of his own decay. When King Henry VIII died in 1547, England did not rejoice. It merely exhaled. The air that left his lungs carried the last breath of a reign that mistook appetite for destiny. His death was not murder, but consumption. The crown that once made him a king had eaten him from within. He was not killed by his enemies. He was eaten alive by his own power. And yet, across the Channel, another monarch was learning the same lesson in a different form. In France, a young king would soon believe his body was made of glass. The mirror of power rarely reflects mercy. While England's king decayed beneath his crown, across the narrow sea another monarch sat in silence, afraid to move. The candles of the French court trembled against walls lined with glass, and the light bent strangely over the still figure of Charles VI, the king who believed he was made of it. He ruled France from 1380 to 1422, a kingdom already trembling under the weight of plague, famine, and war. Yet its greatest fracture began within the royal mind itself. At first, courtiers whispered that the king was tired, that the burden of rule had darkened his thoughts. But soon he refused to be touched. He sat motionless on a velvet chair for hours, terrified that the smallest contact would cause his body to shatter into 1,000 glittering pieces. The rustle of fabric, the clink of armor, even the sigh of a servant made him flinch as if struck. The royal tailor was ordered to sew iron rods into the king's garments to keep his spine rigid and protect his fragile frame. He walked with the stiffness of a statue, his steps slow and heavy under the weight of his imagined shell. To sit, he demanded layers of cushions so that no hard edge could harm him. The court physician, forced to witness these rituals, wrote in despair that his sovereign lives in the terror of his own reflection. The Venetian ambassador described entering the royal chamber to find the king staring into space, whispering to no one, his eyes wide with dread of breaking. The palace became a sanctuary of fear. Servants crept barefoot, afraid that the echo of their movement might disturb the fragile calm. Ministers spoke in whispers. When the king's delusion worsened, meetings were held in darkness, lit only by the faint reflection of candlelight on glass, so that His Majesty might feel less exposed to the world. And yet, every precaution seemed to confirm his madness. The more they tried to protect him, the more brittle he became. Outside the palace walls, France fractured. Nobles fought for power while England invaded. The people looked to Paris and saw not a kingdom, but a mirror cracking along invisible lines. Charles's delusion had become prophecy. The court was made of glass, too, delicate and cold, ready to splinter at the faintest blow. The king's silence spread like frost across the land, freezing everything it touched. In his final years, Charles VI wandered his chambers at night, holding his breath as if afraid that air itself might break him. The once mighty Valois crown glimmered faintly above a man who dared not move beneath it. When he finally died, there was no sound, only the soft collapse of a world already fallen. The court mourned him in whispers, afraid to speak too loudly, as though words might still cut through what remained of his fragile spirit. The kingdom broke long before the king did. The sound of laughter echoed faintly through two distant palaces. In Russia, it came from the marble halls of St. Petersburg. In Denmark, from the frozen corridors of Copenhagen. The voices belonged to kings, yet they were the laughter of children who had never learned to grow up. Peter III of Russia and Christian VII of Denmark ruled in different lands and centuries, but their souls were mirrors of the same broken innocence. Both were born into courts that fed them power before they could understand its weight. Both turned that power into a game that would cost their nations dearly. In Russia, Peter III surrounded himself with toy soldiers. Rows upon rows of miniature regiments stood before him, each one hand-painted, each one a reflection of an empire he barely understood. He spent hours arranging them, whispering orders, moving them across the floor in mock battles. When courtiers entered to discuss matters of state, they found the emperor kneeling among his toys, lost in a world of wood and tin. Sometimes he would rise and hold military trials for rats he claimed had deserted their posts. Witnesses were summoned, sentences were declared, and the condemned were hanged from tiny gallows he had built with his own hands. The empire waited for decisions that never came. Diplomats stood in silence while the emperor played with his toys. His wife, Catherine, watched from a distance as the line between fantasy and rule dissolved completely. The fate of millions rested in the hands of a man still trapped in the mind of a boy. Far to the west, Christian VII of Denmark reigned with the same haunted laughter. He was 17 when he took the throne. a fragile soul already trembling under the weight of voices only he could hear. His court became a circus of humiliation. Ministers and ambassadors were forced to play children's games for his amusement. He made them leap like frogs across the polished floors of the palace, clapping and shrieking when they stumbled. Those who refused were beaten, their dignity stripped by the madness of their king. At banquets, he threw food at guests and burst into laughter when they flinched. He spoke tenderly to his dog, calling it his most loyal minister, and awarded it a title and a salary from the royal treasury. When the animal died, he held a state funeral and wept over the coffin as if mourning a fallen general. Behind the laughter, his mind decayed into violent outbursts and grotesque desires. Servants bore bruises in silence. Diplomats wrote home of a monarch who ruled through chaos and shame. The sound of their laughter echoed through their kingdoms like a curse. The courtiers smiled through fear, pretending that everything was normal. But every smile cracked like glass beneath the strain. Both rulers were puppets of their own disorder, and behind them stood the shadows of those who used their madness to rule in their place. History remembers their crowns, but not their laughter. It remembers the silence that followed. They were not kings. They were children who never stopped playing until the world bled for their games. The story of madness often begins with hunger. In the Ottoman Empire of the 17th century, that hunger took the shape of Ibrahim I, the Sultan who ruled Constantinople from a palace of velvet and fear. 3 centuries later, in the deserts of Egypt, another king named Farouk would inherit the same emptiness. 2 men, divided by time and faith, yet bound by the same craving that devours those who mistake possession for peace. Ibrahim I was born in a cage of gold. As a prince, he spent 25 years locked within the palace walls, isolated from the world to prevent him from threatening the throne. When his brothers died and the cage was opened, what emerged was not a ruler, but a starving soul, deprived of human touch. His first act as sultan was to flood his harem with women. He ordered envoys to search the empire for the heaviest and most beautiful, rewarding those who could bring him bodies vast enough to satisfy the void left by his years of confinement. He believed that the softness of flesh could heal the wounds of power, but desire, when endless, turns into terror. The palace became a labyrinth of silks and screams. Women were chosen, discarded, and replaced as if they were fragments of a dream he could never finish. When jealousy poisoned his mind, Ibrahim commanded that all 280 concubines in his harem be sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. The water closed over them in silence, and for a brief moment, the empire seemed to hold its breath. The currents carried their bodies away, but their absence left a stain that even centuries could not wash clean. Farouk of Egypt ruled a world already modern but still chained to the same appetite. He inherited a throne draped in ancient prestige and wasted it in gluttony. His tables overflowed with food, while his people starved in the streets. He devoured endless feasts, his fingers sticky with sugar and fat, his eyes always searching for more. He stole watches, jewels, and trinkets from foreign guests, not for need, but for thrill. He ordered that only he could own red cars, turning a color into a law and a symbol of his obsession. Behind closed doors, he hoarded forbidden pleasures, building a collection of erotic films and photographs that filled an entire wing of the royal palace. His hunger was not only for food or wealth, but for control, a desperate attempt to prove he was more than a man destined to be forgotten. Both rulers lived as if the world existed only to feed them. Ibrahim sought salvation through flesh. Farouk sought eternity through indulgence. Each built an empire around appetite and watched it rot from within. The palaces they filled became their prisons. The desires they worshipped became their gods. In the end, neither empire could sustain such hunger. The Ottoman throne drowned in blood, and the Egyptian crown sank beneath the weight of its own excess. They mistook desire for divinity and drowned in both. History ends where illusion begins. From the palaces of the East to the castles of the West, two men stood at opposite edges of the same dream. One sought to live forever. The other sought to live outside time. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a united China, and Ludwig II of Bavaria, the fairy tale king of Europe, both built worlds too fragile to survive their own imaginations. Qin Shi Huang rose from war and fire to rule a land that had never been whole. He believed that the heavens had chosen him to bring eternal order, and in that conviction, he began to fear death more than rebellion. Alchemists and mystics filled his court, whispering of elixirs that could defy mortality. Among their creations was mercury, a substance they claimed would cleanse the body of decay. Each morning, the emperor swallowed small drops of poison disguised as medicine, believing that eternity could be contained within his veins. He drifted through his palaces like a shadow, surrounded by armies of terracotta soldiers meant to protect him in the afterlife. He ordered entire valleys sealed to hide his tomb, fearing that even in death he might be betrayed. The emperor who sought to conquer time became its victim. His mind fractured under paranoia. His body trembled with sickness. The man who dreamed of immortality died on a distant road, his corpse hidden among barrels of rotting fish so that no one would know the god had fallen. The first emperor poisoned himself, chasing eternity. Centuries later, Ludwig II of Bavaria stood in the mountains of Germany gazing at his own impossible creation. Neuschwanstein Castle rose against the sky like a dream carved from marble and music. Ludwig lived there almost alone, wandering through halls painted with scenes from Wagner's operas. At night, he dined with invisible kings and toasted to ghosts. His courtiers whispered that he no longer ruled a kingdom, only a fantasy. He rejected the politics of his age, seeking refuge in beauty so pure that it no longer belonged to the world. The more he withdrew into his vision, the more his ministers plotted his removal. They declared him insane and took him away from his castle. A few days later, his body was found floating in a lake beside his physician. The water was still. No one ever learned how he died. Some said he drowned himself, others that he was silenced by those who feared his return. But the truth lies somewhere between tragedy and dream. The last dreamer drowned himself, escaping eternity. Two rulers divided by centuries, one consumed by the terror of death, the other by the longing for a world that never was. Both were undone by the same delusion, that power and imagination could outlive flesh. When kings forget that they are mortal, they become their own executioners. The thrones they left behind now stand empty. The crowns they wore rest in dust and water. Through the corridors of history, the wind still carries their echo. If you wish to keep uncovering the shadows that shaped the world's thrones, subscribe to our channel. Here, every empire still whispers through the cracks of its madness.